Good evening, everyone. My name's John Davis and I'm the director of the MEG89 Group. This is our 89th meeting this evening. And I say a very warm thank you to our friends at Hewlett-Packard for their continued sponsorship. And also tonight, we're co-sponsored by the School of Economics and Finance. Talking of which, we have, I believe, the certainly freshly minted and maybe the most recent visiting professor here, Bill Keegan. Apart from one or two, Bill, I think this is going to be an easy audience for you.
Oh, I've heard that before. Dangerous words.
Now, Bill received that appointment for several reasons, mostly because of his huge amount of teaching that he's been doing on the quiet for our contemporary history side, and we're now going to start to move into more economic history into next year. But what's particularly interesting is that it's not just academically that Bill teaches our youngsters, it's also extracurricular. If you see on any of the tweets from the MEG89 Group, the hashtag WWBD, I can tell you that means what would Bill do? This has been for about 2 or 3 weeks now. So whenever they're in a tricky situation, usually sort of like what to drink, it's hashtag WWBD. I think he's ruining them, actually. But be that as it may, we're here tonight to launch Bill's new book, Saving the World, ? Gordon Brown Reconsidered. It's a fine book. There's a quote on the back from Larry Elliott of The Guardian that says, Bill Keegan is just the man for this sparkling reassessment of GB's time in Downing Street. Saving the World is packed with insights, benefits from a lifetime's experience in charting the ups and downs of the British economy, and is, of course, beautifully written. Bill, we're very honoured that you've chosen us to launch tonight. Over to you.
Thank you very much, John. As soon as the word got around that I was writing this book, there were a lot of people saying that it was going to be a hard task. Gordon Brown, like many chancellors, went through a period of being very popular and then very unpopular. One of his famous jokes in the early days of his chancellorship, which he didn't use so much later, was that there are two kinds of chancellor, those who fail and those who get out in time. He stayed too long in many people's views. There are also two kinds of chancellor. There are chancellors who never go higher than chancellor, although chancellor, I think since Suez, has become the second most important job in the government. Before that it was the foreign secretary, but when it was realised after Suez that we'd basically lost the imperial influence, the chancellorship seemed to be more important. I want to give a little historical background because people talk as if chancellors have never been popular and then unpopular before. But Winston Churchill, in 1925, made a disastrous mistake of taking us back to the gold standard, which the main point being that in order to try and regain international pride, the Bank of England kept interest rates very high to get the pound up, which looked tremendous to bankers, but actually nearly bankrupted most of British industry. And we ended up with actually the 1920s being it was even worse than the 1930s from the point of view of the economic record. There was some recovery in the 30s. He was Chancellor in 25. There was a famous dinner at number 11 when Keynes was present, but he lost the argument because he wasn't up to it. He just wasn't feeling very well that particular day, and that's the way sometimes these decisions are made. The final decision was to go back, although the man who should really have argued them against it was just not on top form. Churchill became Prime Minister, as we all know, later, in 1940, and he's gone down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest Englishman of the 20th century, but he always regretted his time as Chancellor and going back to the gold standard. Later on, post-war, Hugh Dalton was a considerable figure, a great brain, much respected, and then his career fell apart when, over something that seems quite trivial now, on the way in to give his budget, he muttered to a friend of his who happened to be writing for the Evening Standard, and in those days the Evening Standard had more than one edition printed in the morning, one of the things that was going to be in the budget, and it was, and that was considered a leak. These days things are leaked all the time, so that was unfair, but his reputation suffered. Stafford Cripps saw the 1949 devaluation. His reputation suffered for that, although the real point was it was a much delayed devaluation. We then, I'm moving on a bit to the time when I first came into the business. Reginald Maudling was Chancellor from 62 to 64. And he was criticised for being dawdling-maudling and not being expansionary enough with his policies. In the end, he did take the brakes off, encouraged by Harold Macmillan, who was Prime Minister early on, and then not discouraged by Alec Douglas-Home, who took over and who always maintained that he didn't understand the economy and tried to work it out with matchsticks. But the Maudling was actually criticised by people like Roy Jenkins and Labour for not being expansionary enough. After that, everybody criticised him and his reputation suffered. Jim Callaghan was Chancellor from 64 to 67. His reputation suffered because he'd tried to avoid devaluation, and it actually, in the end, we were forced to do it. But the real problem was that the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, had ruled it out, so Callaghan was always in his shadow. He did become Prime Minister from 76 to 79 during a very difficult period. But before leaping onto that, briefly I want to cover Roy Jenkins, who inherited Callaghan's post and was generally considered to be doing a good job in making devaluation work and getting the economy right after all the problems. And then but he's been blamed ever since by Labour because he's been blamed for losing the 1970 election. Well, they would probably have lost it anyway, but he did. He was suffered from the fact that he advised Wilson to go ahead with the election date and did not listen to one of his own advisors who said that there might be some bad trade figures beforehand. And there were some bad trade figures, and the newspapers proclaimed Britain back in the red, and so Jenkins' reputation was as a chancellor was ruined then. In the early 70s, we had Tony Barber and Ted Heath. Well, Tony Barber was really overshadowed by Ted Heath, who was effectively the chancellor. 74 to 79, we had Dennis Healey here last year. A very difficult time for chancellors because we had the oil crisis, which was very inflationary, but also deflationary insofar as we had to produce more goods for our imports. And it happened to coincide with one of the most, unfortunately, one of the most unfortunate decisions made by any government since the war, and it was actually made by the Heath-Barber administration. They geared wages to price increases, in the belief that this would be a fair way of handling the economy, but at just the time when the oil crisis was going on and prices kept going up, wage demands kept going up, we got to the stage in 1975 when inflation was 25%. And obviously something had to be done, and Labour came to grips with it, and by 1979 inflation was down to 10%, but they still lost the election. I must get on to Gordon, so I'll leave forward to Nigel Lawson. Fated as a chancellor for a long time, and then his reputation suffered because of the Lawson boom. When things got out of hand, interest rates got up, a lot of people were worried about what happened to their houses, and he fell out with Mrs. Thatcher. John Major as chancellor did two things. He kept interest rates where they were for most of the year, and he persuaded Mrs. Thatcher to go into the ERM. Black Wednesday 1992 turned out to be quite helpful to the British economy because the exchange rate went back to a reasonable competitive level, but unfortunately it wasn't good for the reputation of either Major or his Chancellor, Norman Lamont. Now, Ken Clarke's chancellorship, I think there is a chancellor that very few people criticised. I think he came pretty well out of all that. He oversaw the recovery. I think it's reasonable to say that infrastructure spending and public investment wasn't as high as it could have been, but nevertheless, I think Clarke's reputation has not suffered. Now, we come to 97 and Gordon Brown. Labour had been out of office for so long that they were terrified, and so Gordon Brown adopted conservative spending plans for 2 years, i.e. a freeze, although Ken Clarke used to go around saying he'd never have kept to the freeze that he'd said he would conduct, but there we are. So it's easy enough to say. Gordon gained a reputation for prudence, and he lost it in the last years. But he was, for a long time, he was considered a very successful chancellor, and he was fated by his natural enemies, who eventually turned on him. Now, the reason why I'm writing this book is that, why I've written this book, is that his reputation has just gone completely down. He's gone from sort of hero to zero, as I say. And I argue in this book that he was not responsible for the world crisis. Although he made mistakes and they became overconfident about revenues from the city, the actual truth is that until the onset of the financial crisis, the debt to GDP ratio was actually lower under New Labour than it had been under Clark, who was quite a successful Chancellor. Then everything went wrong during the financial crisis. Now, it is a commonplace that he didn't seem to know what he was doing when he was Prime Minister. And Steve here has written a very good book about all that. But my argument, in a nutshell, is that while he was being criticised at home, all his experience as the chairman of the International Monetary Fund's key policy-making committee, the IMFC, meant that he built up a fantastic range of contacts, a fantastic range of knowledge. One IMF official once told me, your Chancellor, he comes into a room with a pile of books, his hair all over the place, looking at complete shambles, and then conducts a perfect meeting. So he gained lots of respect, and he was widely appreciated in international circles when the banking crisis occurred. And in 2008 and 2009, it was Gordon Brown who, with good advice from officials, after lots of hesitation, he can be criticised for having such a hang-up about nationalisation that he was slow to appreciate that Northern Rock had to be nationalised, at a time when even Nigel Lawson would have nationalised Northern Rock. But he was the world leader in the bank recapitalisation, which saved the system. Because in the early months of 2009, world trade was actually in free fall. And the second leg of his contribution was when, on April the 1st and 2nd, 2009, he chaired, nagged, bamboozled all the other world leaders into producing a major rescue package, monetary and fiscal, running into trillions of dollars, adding up there may have been some creative accounting, but it had a fantastic effect. Basically, we had the stimulus that saved the day. The other point is he kept us out of the Eurozone. Now, I'm a strong European, and most people are, but I was always against joining the Eurozone because you lose the freedom to adjust the exchange rate. The problem now is that the Eurozone's in a bad way. We're not exactly in a good way, but at least we've had the exchange rate flexibility, and he was certainly helped by Ed Balls in that. Some people say he wavered, but in the end, the man in charge made the right decision about keeping us out of the Eurozone, and it was a brave thing to do. He was even, well, one never knows about Tony Blair's promises, but he even turned down a deal where, despite the fact he was so ambitious to become Prime Minister, when Blair said, OK, relent on the Eurozone and you can take over, he said no, because he actually put the national interest before anything else. Now, some people may think the national interest would have been to go in, but I don't agree. Finally, I just want to say that I think that Gordon Brown, despite all the obloquy he suffered, he was the right man in the right place at the right time, exercising considerable economic leadership in the world, in Europe and in the world. And there is a notable absence of it now. Now, I'm not saying say the world question mark, that was the remark he made in the Commons one day. It was a Freudian slip. But he stopped the rot. We are still in a huge economic crisis. It's not obvious that we're going to get out of it in a hurry. But at least he made, I think, a great contribution. My sadness is that he's now been isolated, and there was no way that George Osborne's government was going to, or Cameron's government was going to nominate him to be the next managing director of the IMF. So I'll pause there.
Thank you very much. We're also very lucky to have... Oh, look at this! We're also very lucky to have Steve Richards of The Independent, a renowned author, certainly of Whatever It Takes, the real story of Gordon Brown. Steve, have you got some remarks?
Yes, thank you very much. This isn't going to be like one of these punch-ups you hear on the Today programme, because I agree with every word. And so the punch-up will have to happen between the platform and some of you. But the reason why I think it is so important to have this corrective is that, from my experience, recent history is the most irrational terrain to wander onto. It's odd, we all lived through this period, and yet I don't think it will be for another 40 or 50 years before we can calmly reflect on it. And we're going through a phase at the moment where it's almost impossible, for example, to give another example from the other side, for Tony Blair to explain Iraq, and I speak as an opponent of that war, but I can see how he got himself into that mess, because it's all too irrational and frenzied. Similarly, if you mention the two words Gordon Brown, or indeed Ed Balls, people start frothing at the mouth, and I became aware of how frenzied and irrational it is at the book launch of Jonathan Powell's memoir, Jonathan Powell, who worked with Tony Blair in Number 10. And it was a bit like this, with sort of Andrew Adonis doing my thing and Jonathan Powell doing his. And all the people in the audience were people who had worked with Jonathan Powell in Number 10. And when it came to the questions, one after another asked a single question. Jonathan, why didn't Tony Blair sack Gordon Brown much earlier on? Even Jonathan Powell's wife asked that. And she prefaced it by saying, you came home every weekend in a good mood saying he was going to sack that bastard next week, and it never happened. And I kind of put my hand up and said, don't you accept, all of you, and there were some very reasoned, rational people in that room, that every now and again in policy terms he was right and some of you were wrong, and I could have been speaking Latin with the sort of angry incomprehension. But actually Tony Blair himself gives the answer in his memoirs, which were in other ways slightly disingenuous, as I'm going to come on to, when he said always throughout he made the judgment in the end that Brown was the best Chancellor, and that's coming from a source who was otherwise very critical in the memoir. And of course the record backs that up. So it is very, very difficult to make a considered judgment. But I would just throw in one or two of the myths whirling around at the moment. One of them is that Brown let public spending rip from about 2004 onwards, and that was one of the main causes of the financial crisis. This was an allegation made in Tony Blair's memoir, who said that he wanted to have a broader review of public spending after the 2005 election. That is true. But if you look at the main source of demands for increases in public spending, it was indeed Tony Blair in his final phase as Prime Minister. As is often the case with Prime Ministers, they are against public spending in general, but want it in specific cases. And so this period where Brown apparently utterly recklessly let loose in order to secure his prime ministership was money spent on city academies, more equipment in Iraq, the Olympics, a whole range of security measures, domestic law and order measures, ASBOs and all this kind of, that were kind of part of the Blair agenda. I don't think they did let rip public spending at that point. There are specific areas of contention which all of us could argue. I agree with the Blairites that he wasted some money on tax credits, for example, which could have been much better spent. But the idea that he suddenly kind of went crazy is an absolute myth, proven by the fact that the Conservatives at the time were calling on him to spend even more. The entire political context of that time has been utterly ignored by what we now know retrospectively. And that, I think, is part of where a reconsideration at some point will take place. The other thing I would throw in, there are many, many points I could make, but we want to have a wider discussion, is that it has now become one of his almost deranged failings, as perceived by the public, that he took an interest in policy detail. You know, it's almost sort of portrayed as mad to kind of spend time. And there were sort of elements of extremism in his micromanagement and absurdity. I remember Peter Mandelson telling me during one bonkers period when Brown was Prime Minister that Mandelson said to him, It was in the summer. Gordon, go away, relax, do some yoga, read thrillers, just forget about everything. And then Madison told me, I went to see Gordon in Southwold, and there on the table was indeed a book. I looked to see which thriller he was reading. And it was Quantitative Easing in Japan, 1992 to 1997. However, you know, on one hand, crazy, on holiday in Southwold reading Quantitative Easing. On another, pretty damned insightful, given the use of quantitative easing here. And sometimes that attention to detail, now either mocked or condemned as bonkers, was extremely useful. One final thing, there is now, I think, a myth, and it could well lose Labour the next election as well as the last one, that by 2010, the economy was in such a Greek-like catastrophic state, rather like the Tories inheriting in 1979, that Labour become unelectable for 2 decades at least. It is worth remembering that the economy was growing, albeit slightly. And there's no doubt in my mind that one of the reasons why it was growing, albeit precariously and with intense fragility, was partly down to the response to the crash that Bill described. A crash which, incidentally, would have tested the most titanic Prime Minister over the last 100 years. Banks on the verge of collapse, seconds to go. The end result by 2010 was an economy slightly growing again. So I think there is a case for the corrective. All of us in this room are fully aware of the huge titanic faults of this figure. But at the moment, the situation is crazy. Whereas I say, if you mention the name and people start foaming with anger, there needs to be some revisionism. And this is the start. Thank you.
Questions? JR. It's come. Can you introduce?
John Rentoul, not at all Blairite. I'm interested in what the counterfactual would be. I mean, you're certainly right that had David Cameron been Prime Minister and George Osborne Chancellor at the time of the crisis, they would have made all the wrong decisions because they condemned the nationalisation of Northern Rock, for example, as Labour going back to the 70s, and they were opposed to all the further bailouts of the banks, if I remember rightly. But the counterfactual that I would be interested in would be what would Tony Blair have done if he'd been Prime Minister and either Gordon Brown or Alan Johnson or David Miliband been Chancellor.
I plead the Fifth Amendment. I just don't know. It's very interesting, this point about Mandelson and Southwold. He was reading a book by Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who had, I think it was his PhD thesis, had devoted his major academic work to the Great Depression. And that helped him a lot. It was because there was an international crisis, whereas the popular paper was saying, oh, he's in Southwold. You know, they were just ignoring it. Sorry, on Blair, I have no idea. maybe.
Can I guess?
Yeah, you guess.
It would have been exactly the same policy. Exactly the same. Because in moments of economic crisis, and it's forgotten that they had quite a few, actually. And in the first term, if you remember, the Tories were predicting a downturn made in Downing Street. And Blair left it to Brown and Balls. And my guess is he would have, A, largely agreed with what they did anyway, and B, his instinct would have been to have let them get on with it.
Charles.
While we're in, Charles Rice, while we're in rehabilitation mode, and I'm sure it's a good idea to some extent, do you buy the repeated Blair argument that he was prevented from going further and faster on public service reforms, whatever those might be, mainly by Gordon?
No, I actually hate the word reform. I think the word reform covers a multitude of sins. They certainly argued about who was going to get the credit. I wish they'd both listened to President Truman, who famously observed that it's amazing what you can achieve if you don't mind who gets the credit. But they were just, they were fighting this spinning amongst themselves. No.
What do you think, Steve? I would have thought that one was an unqualified yes. I mean, Gordon was stopping Tony from his reforms because Gordon had other ideas in mind, right?
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. The specific reforms Tony Blair wanted, he, to some extent, there's no question about it, blocked. The sort of the virtual complete freedom for foundation hospitals, he blocked, for example. Now, there is an argument that he did so on good, solid grounds. And this is the debate. The debate was very cleverly projected by Tony Blair as reform versus anti-reform, with the implication there was only one set of reforms, his, and that anyone who challenged it was anti-reform. Actually, in the Treasury at times, they were big reformers as well, not least of the Treasury, actually, an underestimated area of reform. So it's a bit complicated, but I agree with you. Yes, he did block them.
George.
Was Gordon's decision to sell our gold a right decision? And in all this, what's the role of the Treasury? It's those mandarins. Are the decisions Gordon's alone against the mandarins, or is he going with the flow of the Treasury?
That's a very good question.
There are several mandarins in the audience.
There, I know, yeah, very distinguished mandarins in the audience. First of all, the gold. He didn't sell all the gold. He sold half of it. He sold roughly he sold exactly 55% of the gold. So the other 45% went up in value. The Treasury had wanted to sell the gold for some time. As far as I know, they'd wanted to diversify the reserves. Ken Clarke had wanted to sell the gold, but was dissuaded, as I understand it, by my old friend Eddie George. And Ken Clarke owned up to this at a session at London School of Economics some years ago. And but where he can be criticised is it was sold in an inept way. They let it be known, and the market price fell, so they sold it at an even lower price than they would have done otherwise. But he sold 55% of the gold, and it had been Treasury policy for some time, but not bank policy, and the bank was very much against it. That was one area where an independent bank didn't have much influence.
Please.
I meant the role of the Treasury generally.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Was Gordon going with the flow of advice from his mandarin?
Oh, well,
or
now, if we...
Was he taking those decisions himself?
I've just told you, that the Treasury wanted, as far as I understand it, wanted to diversify the reserves and sell gold. And Ken Clarke agreed with that, but Eddie George vetoed it. And we can go right back. I won't dwell on the Treasury view of the 20s, but there was a famous economic journalist in the 50s called Nicholas Davenport, who was always going on about the Treasury Knights, as you know. One factor behind the entire Brown Balls approach to the Treasury was the feeling that the Treasury was too powerful, a feeling that Labour had always had, and they set out to capture the Treasury. And of course, they were pretty forceful political bosses of the Treasury.
Yes, please.
David Taylor Gooby, sorry. I just wonder, and you know, I've been a Labour Party member a long time and seen lots of these people coming and going. Would you say that the quality needed for a Chancellor is somebody who just understands things and keeps a show on the road? Or is it better to have someone with political ideals and some sort of vision? I mean, a telling point you made is few of them become Prime Minister.
Yeah, I don't think they're necessarily incompatible, actually. I think you need both. It is interesting that some people desperately want to... Roy Jenkins wanted to become Prime Minister after Chancellor and didn't. It wasn't obvious that Callaghan had such an ambition, but he did eventually become Prime Minister. When John Major was, his promotion was, surprised himself, I think. When Nigel Lawson had to resign, or felt he needed to resign, he didn't have to, but he felt, when he decided to resign, as I understand it, in Whitehall, the Mandarins were exchanging notes about who's the next chance is probably going to be JM. This is a chap called John McGregor, who's kind of risen without trace now, but was a prominent Conservative member of Parliament interested in finance and on various committees. But it turned out to be John Major, who'd been Chief Secretary for a short time. So I think you do need both qualities. You probably need the ambition. Dennis Healy, I forget whether he told us when we were here with him a few years ago, but he certainly told me in one interview that having for a long time not really tried, he now wished that he had become leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister. And Healy's ambition was to be Foreign Secretary, which he never was.
James Mates, while we're on the subject of probably much needed revisionism of the latter years, is there room for some revision of the more successful earlier years too? I'm thinking specifically about his possibly first act as Chancellor, which is giving independence to the Bank of England, and along with it, taking away the regulatory role over the banks, which setting up a structure which, albeit his defences, the Tories would have done worse, not a great defence necessarily, when it led to a financial crisis, which was essentially a crisis of regulation. It wasn't inevitable that we had to have it. The Canadians and the Australians proved that. And to what extent should that be on Gordon Brown's record?
Well, it's certainly, he deals with it in a widely unread book that he wrote after the crisis. He feels... He seems to me to be rather ambivalent about this because there are plenty of speeches that he made on the record in all sorts of forums advocating for much greater international regulation. But in this, I think, rather pusillanimous way that Labour had towards the city, he just tended to leave it alone. The motivation seemed to be punishing the Bank of England for having for various regulatory failures before, namely, what was it? It was Johnson Matthey Bank and BCCI, yeah, and Barings, yeah. And so, in a way, it was a punishment. But on this, the first part of your question, I think I can say that I was one of the few financial journalists who, notwithstanding my friendship with Gordon Brown and with Ed Balls, I actually opposed at the time the granting of independence to the bank. I think that in the end, you have to have democratic control, and I think there was a fashion that developed. But I think now, various public statements the Governor of the Bank of England has made have been, I think, out of order and have been approving of the fiscal stance, with which I personally disagree. And the obsession with inflation targeting, which was encouraged by the Governor, did mean that in its role as the guardian of financial stability, the bank took its eye off the ball of regulation. But there are always going to be problems. Anybody who's in charge of regulation is at some stage going to have a career disaster, in my opinion.
Hello, Stephen Stern. Bill, as you know, the two Eds are currently being urged by people on all sides, really, to confess the sins, as they are alleged, of the last Labour government in terms of spending. What might be the consequences of them actually ever doing this, or do you think they're right to hold the line and point to the actual relative smallness of the deficit at the time the crisis struck?
Well, I think they can hold the line and make admissions. I think they have actually made admissions about some mistakes they made. But I think there's a trap being set for them at the moment. They've got to be very careful of. If Labour is just seen as a party that would cut like the present government, but not so much, it doesn't look too good politically. Although the fact of the matter is that a lot of a fair percentage of the cuts that have taken place so far were already in the pipeline. But to counterbalance that, there would have been more expansionary measures, I think. I think the withdrawal of the VAT, the restoration of the VAT cut was a very bad mistake, which, going back to what Steve was saying earlier, I think that hit the recovery on the head, actually.
Alan.
Thank you. Alan Evans. Leaving aside some of the policy differences between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, one of the things you haven't really talked about, although you've touched on it, is the difference in organisation, people and planning. I mean, one of the things, if you look at the Blair regime, is he had a lot of powerful people around him, from Mandelson to Alistair Campbell, Jonathan Powell, Philip Gould, David Miliband on policy, Angie Hunter, Sally Morgan. When Gordon came in, he had precious few by comparison, and some of them, Ed Balls notably, then went off to run a department of himself. So leaving aside, the policy differences, here was a Prime Minister with, I would argue, fewer people, less planning capacity, less organisation, faced with a massive economic crisis and dealing with a lot of it by himself, which just wondered if you think whether that is a perspective which hasn't been looked at in enough detail.
Can I say one? You're the expert on that. Can I say one thing on that? But Steve is the expert on that. I think that it was a mistake to isolate people, his enemies, people like, really substantial figures like Charles Clarke. Just keep them out the cabinet. I think it's. I think that your critics are better often inside the tent rather than out. But Steve is the real expert on that.
You made a terrible mistake with Charles Clarke. You offered to make him special envoy to Baghdad. In all seriousness. He said to Clarke there was a special construction operation that he wanted to make him particularly involved with, which Charles Clarke said to me, if I wasn't shot en route to this construction, I would have been there. So that's one example of insensitivity. But I think the key point is a very, very good one you made, that when in '97, in opposition, Blair had already formed a formidable team. They all went with him into number 10, all of them. And he even got Mandelson to be in the cabinet office, so he was next to him, dealing with things. Brown, the opposite happened. And in particular, I mean, in my mind, it's very interesting that between '97 and the first 10 years, there were lots of emphasis on the Blair-Campbell relationship, the Blair-Mandelson relationship, and of course the Blair-Brown relationship. I think the second most important relationship in New Labour was the Brown-Balls relationship. And Brown was wholly dependent on this figure. I mean, I was aware of this anyway, but I became very conscious of it once when I went one Friday, drove with Balls to his constituency in the north of England, and he must have received there and back, I would say 7 calls from Brown. Brown was Prime Minister then, on the economy, and Balls was Schools Secretary. And I think the departure of Balls, by the way, the two of them hardly talk now, it's another casualty of this great drama of politics. But I think the loss of Balls deeply damaged it. And in the meantime, there was no equivalent of a really formidable head of policy. It was, from the beginning, one of the weakest number 10 operations, I think. I mean, there's a lot of talk at the moment about how weak the Cameron one is. The Brown one was much weaker.
Sorry, can I put note to that, because this Balls relationship goes right back to 1994, I think, when... was it 92 or 94?
I think it was when Balls joined,
yeah,
93.
93, yeah. And Ed Balls had written a pamphlet for the Fabians saying that we should on no account have anything to do with the European monetary system or the single currency. And Gordon had actually been, that Labour had been very pro, Gordon and John Smith had been very pro. So at the first interview when Ed Balls was sent along by the FT actually to see through the good offices of the then editor, to meet Gordon, he said, I have to confess that I disagree with a lot of your policies. And he really was responsible for the change they made, and also for the independence of the Bank of England. That was Ed Balls' idea. And also, I think that his influence was very important on the... because at various times, I think that Gordon Brown, with all the pressure, had his moments of doubt about the big decision on the euro, but Ed Balls never did. And I think, but it's difficult to, but nevertheless, I think Gordon Brown gets the credit as the, if that's what you're inclined to do, which I am, for the decision.
Please.
Tom Robinson, I do an MA here at QMU. Piggybacking on the back of that question, Can I ask the panel, even you, John, if you want to
thanks.
answer? Do you not think Gordon Brown should have perhaps been more ambitious with his choice of Chancellor then, and maybe make it Ed Balls instead of good old Mr. Alistair Darling? One more thing. I also thought your Mandelson impression was fantastic.
But you thought where they came from for another occasion.
Well, it all depended on timing, because I think Ed Balls certainly wants to be Chancellor, but at the moment when it all happened, he wanted to get some independence, some perceived independence from Gordon Brown. Just as earlier on, he'd been an advisor a political advisor in the Treasury, then he managed to become Chief Economic Advisor, and then later on he became a minister. And I think he got genuinely interested in schools, but I may be wrong about that. And then later on, there was a moment when, during the expenses scandal, when even Alistair Darling, for a time, looked as though he could be vulnerable. It was very haphazard, the way that some ministers and politicians were pursued by the press and some weren't. And there were some grey areas. And I think there was a contingency plan that Balls would be made Chancellor if Alistair Darling had to resign, which he didn't in the end.
Please.
Brian Unwin, Bill, you know my views on Europe, and you said very little. I won't go on about the euro, but I'm a little sceptical about the alleged ability to adjust our exchange rate. It seems to me to have done us a fat lot of good when you look at the trade figures and the balance of payments in the last few years. But can I just make one point? Although Gordon obviously established great friendships and alliances at the IMF Interim Committee, I do think that over his period of Chancellor, he alienated our European colleagues throughout his time. I mean, I saw him many times in action at ECOFIN, and he either displayed ostentatious lack of interest, sitting doing his constituency correspondence, or delivered arrogant lectures on how to run their economies. And I think he did quite a lot of damage to our relationship with the European Union during that time. I wonder whether either of you has any further comment on that.
I'd certainly agree with a lot of that. I think I've got a quotation from an official here about, his behaviour was often impossible, this is in regard to Europe. Even when he condescended to be at meetings, he would look bored, read emails, read his briefs, bite his fingernails, in fact, do anything but look interested, which is called... All my contacts in 40 years of journalism have been off the record until they themselves put themselves on the record. There was an occasion some years ago at a dinner party when somebody said to me, how did you get that story that Thatcher had chosen John Major to be her successor? And I said, my lips are sealed. And George Blunden, who happened to be the Deputy Governor of the bank at the time and knew Thatcher very well, said I told him.
Sure.
But yes, he did. No, but to a serious point, despite that, at the level of Sarkozy, he had a good relationship, and during the crisis, I don't agree, I think the behaviour was appalling and unforgivable, the way he used to behave. Nevertheless, he established good relations with Sarkozy, and when Sarkozy and Merkel weren't getting on too well, he was actually, he brought them together. As I say, he rose to the occasion. The sort of Time magazine compared him to Churchill's, at finest hour. Well, obviously, it wasn't quite like that, but nevertheless, Time magazine did think that he was the right man there. Sorry.
Sean Cleary. How critical was it to Gordon Brown's premiership that he didn't call an early election?
We've both Steve's written a book about it, but briefly, I'll just say he clearly bottled it, but Steve really has the scoop on this.
No, I don't. I've got a different view to everybody else. Slightly different from a scoop. I'm of the view that if on the day he didn't call it, which was first Saturday in October, I think, of 2007, if he had called it then, he could well have lost. And that is not a widely held view. And I think he was in a situation that weekend where he was utterly trapped. It was a trap that he partly made himself by raising the possibility of an early election. But if he had called one, he could well have lost. Think about it. Here's a figure who'd wanted to be Prime Minister since age 6 months. He finally got it, unlike most leaders in waiting, Dennis Healey and others, and then gave it away after 5 months. I mean, I think someone with an always fairly insecure personality would have gone absolutely crazy, and understandably so. But in calling that in not calling that election, he was doomed to 3 years of hell. And the falling out of his entourage was also very damaging. I'm still finding out quite how damning that weekend was. You know, the Bulls, Ed Miliband, and all these other characters, Douglas Alexander, never trusted each other again because of their different reactions to that weekend. And so it was an extraordinary period in British politics.
But Steve, sorry, yeah.
Sorry.
No, didn't that also ruin his plan, another plan for an election?
Oh yeah, sorry. His original plan when he came in was to hold an election in the summer of 2008. He felt, if you remember, Labour were behind in the polls in that final Tony Blair period by quite a long way. They were even behind on issues like the health service. And he felt he needed about a year to turn around perceptions on things like health and other areas where they were losing, and to show that he could be a prime minister, because all the colleagues, even those vaguely sympathetic to him, wondered whether he could be a prime minister. And he felt he would need about that period, and he planned to hold the election in May 2008. That was the early plan. And then suddenly he had this honeymoon, which he hadn't anticipated, which was to die for. I mean, Cameron was really worried. And that fueled the speculation about an early election. They stupidly then decided to fuel it even more, to panic Cameron. And that was their mistake. And so that's why they are partly to blame for it. But it would have happened anyway, because polls were putting in 15 points ahead. But in the build-up to the decision, polls were swinging way back in the marginal seats to the Conservatives. And that's why I've got this theory that it would have been a massive risk for him to have called it.
And he's a very cautious person.
Very cautious. Ed Balls, by the way, it was part of their falling out from which there has been no recovery, was adamant he should have called it. Yeah. And on the Friday, when they made the decision, he was still in his constituency, he was on the phone saying, call it. But the others around him advised against, which was part of the falling out from which there has also been no recovery.
Please.
John Palmer. Bill, I want to go back to the issue of banking regulation, lack of, etc. And what I thought was a quite extraordinary speech that Brown made at the Mansion House when he didn't defend, he boasted about his single-handed resistance of those calling for greater regulation of the city institutions, and said, I hope you understand just how widespread these pressures have been, and I'm pleased to say, because I understand the essential role of your services for the British economy, I have resisted it. It was a major affirmation rather than a... And I'd like just to hear a little bit more about how that's to be understood. I mean, I should say that I only really knew Gordon Brown at a much earlier stage when he was writing the Red Book in Scotland. Yep. So, though I was present at the last ECOFIN meeting in Luxembourg, or present covering it as a journalist, when they had the first meeting of the Eurogroup, and the chairman announcing the transition said, well, now, if the ministers from the non-participating states would withdraw, we'll begin our meeting. And he protested violently and thought he should stay for some extraordinary reason.
Well, I think I used the word pusillanimous earlier. I think he was just, in the face of the city and the pressure, he was very weak. And also he became like a Bobby Soxer with regard to bankers. Sorry, Bobby Soxer is a 50s term, really, isn't it? Alan Greenspan and the theory that the market will spread risk perfectly. But I also used the word, I think, ambivalent earlier, because one part of him was accepting all this, and another part was giving speeches saying we needed a lot more global regulation. It is a puzzle, but I agree with you. He made that speech, and I thought it was pretty disgraceful, actually.
Please.
Adam Raphael, you've touched on the failure to call an election. Arguably the other great mistake, and I wonder how one can either explain, excuse, defend, was his comments about abolishing boom and bust, which will haunt him. There may be some satisfactory explanation, but I've not heard one.
There is no satisfactory explanation. I think one of my chapter headings is bust after boom, a soundbite bites back. It was a huge mistake. It showed, well, you know, he's an historian, and he's a very clever man. John Smith said that he was the cleverest man he'd ever met. Well, but nevertheless, it was a very silly thing to say. And it was even quoted, I talked to people like Jean-Claude Trichet. I talked to many people doing this book and looking at the European background, with whom, by the way, he got on very well despite his bad behaviour. And Trichet himself made the same point, you know, what a foolish thing to say.
But there is an explanation, not an excuse. I mean, there isn't. It was crazy misjudged, because obviously at some point there was going to be, in this economic cycle, a bust, and how would he explain it? However, there is an explanation, which is this, that with their so-called fiscal rules in the early period, and being tough on public spending, and all the other things they were doing to, in their view, establish economic stability and market confidence. At one point, they had a meeting where they all agreed, well, no one, he said to Paul, no one understands these rules. How are we going to explain it? And Paul's saying, well, this will stop the Lawson kind of boom from happening, because we've trapped ourselves in by our rules. So there won't be a Lawson bust. And one of them said, end of boom and bust. And it was their attempt to explain fiscal rules, the spending freeze, which you were arguing against in your columns, and all the other things they were doing to try and prevent that kind of Lawson-type boom. And they thought that's a way of explaining it. And that's why I'm not justifying it, but that's the explanation.
And indeed, the initial phrase, I think, was no more Tory boom and bust, which was quite common. And as it happened, consumer spending during the Lawson boom went up by something like, it went up a lot more. So the Brown boom in consumer spending was actually a lot less than the Lawson boom, but he's landed with it. He told me, I've quoted him in the book somewhere, he said, I know I've got to take the rap. Please.
Thank you, Bill. Lionel Price. I'm just trying to pull together a couple of comments you've made. The one saying, quoting you made just a minute or two ago, Gordon Brown speaking in favour of the city and didn't want to do anything to damage the city. Right at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned about the large amount of revenue that the city generated. And I just wonder, the city generated from a lot of activities of dubious social benefit, and on what are profits, which are now appear to have been illusory, and a lot of that money is reversing out of the Treasury again, and that's been a major part of the financial crisis the government's now in. I just wonder, in being so nice to the city, was Gordon Brown cognizant of how much money the city was generating for the public revenue?
Oh, definitely, yes. I thought you were going to say, are they related? Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Right over the back, that's it. Gentleman down, hello.
Thanks. James Morris, I'm a pollster. Stephen, you talked about trying to resurrect Gordon Brown's reputation, people frothing at the mouth, but his reputation was lost in 2007, before the financial crisis, and this discussion's been a lot about the financial crisis. Partly because he didn't bring the antidote to Blairism that people expected to, but I just want to share my pet theory and see what you think, which is the thing that prompted the Tory resurgence was Osborne's move on inheritance tax. In the budget earlier in that year, Brown had been considering moving on inheritance tax and instead did not do it but instead did 10p, 20p, fiddling around with tax. So I think if he had addressed the inheritance tax threshold and not done the 20p, 10p thing, which did him no benefit, did him a harm, the Tories wouldn't have had the rabbit to pull out of the hat. He would have had an election, he would have succeeded, he would have gone into the financial crisis with a strong reputation, which would have allowed him to keep the benefit he got. Because remember, his numbers went up after the G8, whatever the conference was, and he would now be seen very, very positively rather than negatively. So that, I think, is the mistake. What do you think?
Well, it's a great theory. I like it.
Yes, please.
My name is Anthony Isaac. I have nothing to do with economics or journalism. I'm a great friend of Bill's. He received a lot of opprobrium for what he did with the pension funds, taxing them. Was that a good idea, and what has been the long-term effect of that?
I spent most of my professional life avoiding the subject of pensions. But the fact of the matter is, at the time, he was doing some deal with the CBI, it was to do with corporation tax. At the time, there was very little criticism. Many things have gone wrong with pensions, including low interest rates and annuities and so on. But that was certainly, although at the time it didn't seem to me to be a huge mistake, it's certainly gone down in history as one, and he's blamed for it. Yeah.
Right, lots of hands, and we're running out of time. Dom first, and we'll move forwards.
Yeah, we've spoken a bit about Brown's acolytes in terms of ministers, but can we just have a brief appraisal or criticism of the likes of Damien McBride and Charlie Whelan and their role in sowing seeds of just bitterness and resentment in his head, because they have been criticised for doing that?
It's really, when I used to see Damien McBride when he was a very intelligent man, by the way, and he was always very good discussing policy. But one day he sent me an email saying that he was moving over to the dark side, and how.
He's rehabilitating on his blog at the moment, isn't he? It's a must read. Okay.
Well, he's a very clever man, and unfortunately he went over the dark side for a time.
Eduardo da Costa, Queen Mary Labour. I wanted to ask about universal benefits. Do you think, with hindsight, the extension, the ever-growing extension of universal benefits to those that really don't need it, has done a disservice to the benefits, because it's now been used as a way of pointing to Labour's constant spending as being just a needless way of winning votes?
On the whole, prefer, when you get things like child benefits, it may be an out-of-date view, but I think everybody should get them, and then they should be taxed, because I think it's a good concept for a good society for children. I cannot believe what they are doing about removing benefits from children. I mean, from people who have more than one or two children. I find it just crazy. And as for the effect on disability, this is where this government. Steve mentioned earlier the tax credit. I mean, that was a jungle. I mean, I'm not sure that even Gordon Brown understood tax credit. I remember Geoffrey Howe, when I was interviewing him from this book of mine that has yet to come out about chancellors, said to me that his gardener had presented him with a tax credit form with 40 pages, and that he, and Geoffrey Howe was always considered one of the duller chancellors who loved the small print. He'd been Solicitor General and he couldn't understand it. So there was a lot of criticism of it, but nevertheless, as we get cut after cut, and as the correspondence pages, especially The Guardian, are full of very interesting stories, and I commend Polly Toynbee's columns about what's actually happening on the ground, cutting back of benefits, I think this is absolutely terrible.
Jeremy.
It's Jeremy Jennings from Queen Mary. I was actually with Gordon Brown recently in Kirkcaldy for a few days, and it was a very strange experience. There were lots of bagpipes, actually. It was one of the things that was really very strange about it. Wherever we went, there was someone playing bagpipes. I got sick of it, really. But no, but it was really one thing that was strange. And obviously, he was amongst people who've known him for a long, long time. And this is nothing that says. It was interesting that a number of people, sense, were just quite simply frightened of the man. I mean, there was that real sort of, that really deep ambivalence about him as an individual. But I suppose my question is really this. It was also very tragic, actually. It was very, very sad to be with him because he was this man who was clearly, frankly, lost and very uncertain about what he was going to do. And if you what you said just a little while ago about the fact that the government will block any attempts that he has to achieve any sort of international role, what's his future? I mean, he's not an old man. What's he going to do? I think it's just very, very sad.
Well, I'm I haven't been up to the bagpipe scene recently, although I gather that Alistair Campbell's been playing them at weddings. But he's a very wounded man. I mean, he's a very complex figure, and all his all these character defects have been written about all over the place. And he's going through a very hard time. But he was, I don't think he's in Asia now, but he was in, I'm in email contact with him, and he's certainly very interested in the international scene. He keeps sending me stuff on it. He's in touch with Bernanke and all these people, and Larry Summers in America. And I think it's a great loss that he's not there. So I'm hoping there'll be some rehabilitation, and I'm hoping that he'll, the people who are scared about his behaviour, I'm hoping that he's learned a lesson about talking to Europeans.
Ben.
Thank you. Ben Draper, Marline Group. Slightly sort of leads on from Jeremy's question, actually. I mean, we hear so much about how much of a bad communicator he was, all these character flaws, etc., particularly contrasting Tony Blair's, ability for communication and, coming forward as a personality as well. I was wondering if you can shed some personal insight, Bill, as a friend of his. When are we going to see some memoirs? Because I'm chomping at the bit. I cannot wait. It's going to be fascinating.
Well, one of the things I've drawn on in my slim volume is a book he wrote called Beyond the Crash, after which was widely, as I said earlier, widely ignored. But there's quite a lot of stuff in there. But I think most people were just looking for tittle-tattle about Mandelson, and it's a very serious book. But I think there will be some memoirs at some stage. But it is a slow process, and I think it's very, but he, in a sense, he must know he's only got himself to blame for all the people he antagonised. But I'm hoping he'll make a comeback, and I've been either brave enough or foolhardy enough to try and start it with this book. Charles Clarke said to me, if anybody can do it, you can have a go.
Hi, Ken Penton. At one stage in my life, I actually worked for Gordon Brown when I was sent in 1993 in the run-up to the first unified budget when I was a young Labour student to do all the important photocopying, which included photocopying Ed Balder's CV and all the others for his interview. So it was in 1993. But actually, later in life, I ended up from 2000 to 2008 being head of politics and media for what was the ISTC when I joined, then Community Trade Union, which was mostly steel workers, but a manufacturing union. And my two questions are based upon that experience, really. One was, and it, I think it's influenced by his attitude to the city, I suspect. But, whilst I recognise Gordon Brown was right on some big calls like the euro, although I and my union didn't think so at the time, and also in the financial crisis, 2007, 2009, didn't he fail to make sure we had the balanced economy and to have, that we were overexposed to the city and the size of it, and we're still paying that price? And secondly, one of the things I ended up working with for my union was, without going into the detail, because you said you don't like pensions, but for 5.5 years, for people who lost their occupational pensions, negotiating with Gordon Brown as advisors, my union ended up taking the UK government to the European Court of Justice, led to the set-up of the Pension Protection Fund and the Financial Assistance Scheme, and settling, I think, for 12.5 billion in the end. But it took 5.5 years of blood, sweat and toil, and some of the discussions we had with Gordon directly and with his advisors were not the prettiest. And in my experience, I wonder whether you agree, there is intellectual inflexibility got in the way of doing the politically and morally right thing.
Well, there's certainly a limit to which I'm prepared to be an apologist for that kind of thing. And once again, I'm going to complete the Fifth Amendment on pensions. I sympathise, but I'll leave it at that. I want to go back to your first question, because I think that's very important. That, again, not only did I oppose the independence of the Bank of England, but I did think that he was, that throughout the Thatcher period and the Major period and the New Labour period, there wasn't enough attention paid to manufacturing and all this stuff about our future lay and services. There was a lot of neglect. Going back to something that Brian Unwin said just now, and by the way, Brian's a distinguished former Treasury official, head of the European Investment Bank, and a great friend. And we're both very European, but he's more European than I am. But he made the point about the exchange rate. The terrible thing is, I think that one of the problems of this country is that the long neglect of manufacturing is becoming more apparent, and the recent trade figures, if they are what they say, then there's some dispute, they may be revised, but I think that the exchange rate adjustment was necessary, but it might not turn out to be in a sufficient condition, and that there might be even more to come. So that may be the next crisis.
Okay, last question. Matt.
Matthew Jackson, CFA and the Mile End Group. Bill, you gave me kindly a copy a few weeks ago, and it's a very digestible and exciting read, something that you can do in a day or two at the most. I think one thing that I'd just ask as a footnote, really, is if you could decipher the significance of the dedication of the book, SK1 and SK2.
We live in a world where, I mean, my wife Hilary is known as Hilary Stonefrost, her maiden name, but some people, some women, when they get married, do choose the name of their husband, and it so happens that my two older sons, who are in the audience, are married to Sarahs. And both of them have called themselves Sarah Keegan. One is Dr. Sarah Keegan, and the other isn't. But anyway, I realised that my older children were referring to them as SK1 and SK2, and I dedicated previous books to Hilary and to my older children. I thought, well, that's time to move on. Let's dedicate it to my daughters-in-law.
Okay, it's all for me left to say is next week we have the 90th meeting of the Mile End Group, when Oliver Letwin will come and talk about coalition policy making. Books are available in the foyer to be signed, correct?
Yep.
And if you'll join me, please, in thanking Steve Richards and Bill Keegan. Very nice, very nice.